Okay, welcome to week 2 of the Color Jolt Quilt Along. It has been a heck of a week, guys. I've been sick. I feel like everything that can go wrong with everything has gone wrong. And I will just say that one of the things I've really appreciated is just the simplicity of doing this quilt one step at a time. When I make a quilt, a lot of times I try to do all of the things at one time. I just want everything to be efficient and fast. And one of the things I love about quilt alongs is just that even pace to it. I know a lot of you are working ahead, but you don't have to. So, week 2, this week we're just cutting our fabric, and if you want to make a test block, you can. I'll have a separate video on making a test block for those of you that are not familiar with paper piecing or who just want to try things out so you can hit the ground next week running. Let's talk about cutting our fabric. I'll try to be quick, partially because I will invariably start having a coughing fit at some point here when I am on camera, which sounds terrible. So, the 2 pieces in your pattern that you're going to want to look at first to cut are pages 6, which has this diagram on it that shows you where all your background fabric pieces are going to go, and then page 9, which has the exact same corresponding colors and letters and shows you how to cut out your background fabric out of your background fabric pieces out of your 1 3/4 yards of background fabric that you have. So this is actually pretty easy. Almost all of your strips are going to be 1.5 inch wide strips. A couple of those, like 2 different sets, will then get cut down into smaller pieces, which will end up being the... Here, let me grab a quilt. So one section are going to be these middle of the stripe block pieces. One will be these short in between the block pieces. And then you'll have some longer sections that are your sashing. Excuse me. And then some wider ones for the border. Either way, it's just a lot of strip cutting. If you have a stripology ruler, this is the time to use it. My only advice would be that you want this fabric to be on grain before you cut it. There's several different ways to do that. The easiest way to learn about that is to go on YouTube and Google on grain, because there's a lot of really good videos that are relatively long and in-depth, much longer than I'm going to cover here. But the long story short way to do this, I'm not going to show you the rip the fabric method, but that's a good one if you want to Google it, is basically if you line up the selvages of your fabric like this and put them together. I'm going to intentionally do this where it's not on grain because I know this fabric is already on grain. Okay, so it looks like it should be correct because these selvages are together, right? But then when you look down here at the bottom, you see how the bottom of that is like swooping to one side? What happens is when fabric gets pulled onto the bolt, when it comes off the machine, a lot of times these 2 layers of fabric you have are pulled at different like tensions essentially, and so they slide a little bit. So what will happen is you get your fabric on the bolt, it has this nice crease at the bottom of it. You think that means that this is, perfect. You cut a straight line from this crease, and you think that means that all of your cuts are going to be on grain. So on grain, I'm not going to go into it. But basically, okay, I will go into it briefly. So your fabric is woven from 2 sets of cross threads, right? One is called the warp and one is called the weft. They run perpendicular to one another. When you cut fabric, you want to cut it essentially along one of those lines, the one that runs from the selvage to the selvage. If you cut right on parallel with that line, then your fabric won't bow one way or the other, your strip that you cut. If you kind of cut off grain, which means you're slightly cutting across the lines instead of with the line, then your fabric is essentially a little bit on bias and it will stretch and squiggle and stuff like that. If you've ever cut really long strips and then you open them up and it's like kind of curving one way or the other, and that doesn't make any sense because you could have sworn you cut it at a perfect right angle to your fresh, crisp, on the bolt bottom seam, that's because your fabric was probably not quite on grain on the bolt. So the way to figure that out is to ignore your crease that's at the bottom here that already was there. Line up your selvages and then kind of move them along each other, left or right, and watch your bottom seam and wait until you'll be able to tell as you move it farther one way, it'll get wonky at the bottom. And then as you slide it back the other way, you'll kind of find a point where it like suddenly lines up. And if you keep sliding it past that point, it gets wonky again the other way. And so you'll know that like the middle part there that you had lined up was the correct part. So, yeah, that's getting things on grain. I would love to go into that more, but I know that for a lot of you, you'll already have cut your fabric or you already know how to do on grain. So I'm not going to go into it right now. But like I said, there's a lot of really good videos from very reputable sources on that on YouTube if you're interested. However, I will say for this quilt, I would consider cutting things on grain for your background fabric kind of a bonus. A lot of these strips are going to get cut down to smaller strips. As I just went over, those it's less important to be on grain. So it's mainly just like your long vertical or horizontal strips between your rows that you want to make sure are on grain. In which case, there's not that many of them and it'll quilt out if it's a little wiggly. But if you cut on grain, things will square up more nicely. More nicely? Nicely. Anyway, so that's your background fabric. Line it up so that it's on grain and everything looks nice. And then cut your strips. You want to label your strips as you go along to keep track of them because some of the 1.5s will get cut down, some of them won't. That should all be pretty straightforward. So what we're actually going to talk about is cutting your trapezoids. So the things you will need for this are your layout. So here's my layout. I have it all numbered. And then you don't have to use this, but I would highly recommend a cutting sheet. I will link this again in the email. This lets you go through your fabrics and tally up how many A/B templates you need and how many CD templates. So, sorry, I'm getting a little close to the camera for end of the day, sick day filming. Anyway, so your A/B and CD templates look like this. A/B, CD, they're not the same as you can see. And your A/B template is what you'll use to cut all the fabrics that are going to go on A/B blocks, CD for the other ones. So the most efficient way to cut these out, if you are using the exact amount of yardage as called for in the pattern, then you do need to cut these out efficiently. And the way to do that is by cutting them out in squares. So here's an A/B template. If you look at it with a CD template, there's no way to pair these up that you can cut out very efficiently. But if you have two A/B template pieces, you can flip one upside down and cut out this nice square first, and then just cut it in half on an angle, and you'll have two A/B pieces. So I don't know what size fabric this is. This isn't my actual fabric. So in this instance, if you needed to cut out two A/Bs, you would cut out the square, then you would cut that in half. For a fat quarter, for instance, you can fit two, I think this is a half yard, so it should be the same width though. For a fat quarter, you can put two different triangles down here and then cut them two different ways. And if you cut them one way, you'll get two CD templates. Other way, you'll get two A/B templates. You'll always have a little extra over here. So there's a number of ways you could go about cutting out the square and cutting it in half. I'll let you figure that out. But long story short, you want to, again, this is a moment you want to make sure that you're cutting things in pairs for your fabrics if you have a limited amount of fabric. I had a ton of extra fabric because I used a lot of fabrics and I had a lot of yardage, in which case it doesn't matter. You can cut out, an uneven number. If I cut out 3 CD templates from this, I can do one that's a square, and then I can just cut a random other one out from right here. That's fine. I'll have room for that. If you're using the exact yardage in the fabric, then you need to actually make sure that you're doing your squares. So I hope that makes sense. If you do find yourself in a bind, these templates are slightly larger than they technically have to be for a variety of reasons. But if you're a experienced paper piecer, you can trim off about 1/4 inch on this edge and this edge, and it should still give you a big enough trapezoid that you will be able to cover the relevant portion of your paper piece block. You're just going to have to be slower and more careful. I wouldn't recommend cutting your templates down unless you find that you are kind of in a bind with your fabric and you need to get more trapezoids out of them than you could if you leave them. The other thing I will mention here is as you cut your fabric pieces out, there might be a moment where you pull out one of your block templates and you are maybe after you do all your fabric cuts, you're like, oh, I'm going to lay them all out with my block templates. And you're going to pull out the block template and you're going to pull out the AB piece of fabric you cut, and you're going to have a moment where you're like, oh no, they don't fit. They don't line up. That is because in paper piecing, your fabric, the back side of your fabric meets the back side of your paper. So your paper piece block is just a foundation for building your actual fabric block. And as your foundation, it ends up being reversed from your final fabric block. So for your fabric cutting, I would ignore all of your block pieces that you printed for now. Those are not going to help you. They can only accidentally confuse you. Instead, you're just going to want to use your cutting chart and these A, B, and C, D templates. If you follow those two together, you're going to end up with the right pieces for next week when we start assembling things. So that's it. Happy week 2. I'm so glad you guys are here. I'm really enjoying seeing all the quilts you're making. Make sure that you tag me in